My name is Diedre Steele Ness. I was born April 16, 1964. I've been in Farmington since I was 1.
Okay, and this interview is for the Farmington Oral History Project, and we just want to verify that we have your permission.
Yes, you have permission to record me, yes.
Thank you. And tell me, who were your parents?
My parents were John Steele and Janie Buchanan Steele.
And tell me about their history in city government.
My father was the mayor, and I forgot the exact years, but I was in high school, so probably late 1970s, early 80s. And my mom was involved on the city council for many years after that too.
Okay, now your interview, you're going to give us an overview of the city history from the beginning, kind of
yes.
for the first 100 years. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm going to give a brief history of Farmington's early history.
Okay, well, why don't you just tell us as you best can, and
Okay. The earliest settlers of Farmington, John Connor, he arrived in late 1828. And Josiah Trent, he arrived in early 1829. And by the 1830s, early 30s, we had probably 15 families in the Farmington area. So they were already a little community. Josiah Trent was a Methodist minister. And so he started a church in his home. And by 1833, there were like 6 families. And they were the Trents, the Connors, the Kennebrews, the Woolseys, Polsons, and Woodruffs. And they started the first church in Farmington. And they built a small log cabin, 1 room. And that location was on, the current location is like where the bus barn is right now on Lossing Street. And they named it the Ebenezer Meeting House. So they called their church the Ebenezer Methodist Church. And they called the school, which used the same building, the Ebenezer School. And in 1837, the Baptist church formed in Farmington, and they used the same building, and they were called the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So the early history records of Farmington were actually going to be under the Ebenezer name, because that's where the main meeting house was. And they used that building until 1848, and they built another building. And they called this one the Hawthorne House. And that was the church and the school building also. And the Hawthorne building was just used for 10 years. But the building lasted much longer, and it was used as a barn later on. In 1908, several of the students, they met for a reunion, and they had their photograph taken in their old schoolhouse. So we have a picture of that building, and it's again still a 1-room log cabin house with all these older people who used to go to school there. And the third building that was built, that was in 1858, and that was also called Ebenezer Meeting House. And they had the Methodist church would meet there, the school would meet there, and the Baptist church met there for a short while until they built their own building. And the school met there, and it was for over 30 years. And it was in the current location of the Farmington Cemetery. So if you find some old obituaries from the 1800s, it might even say the Ebenezer Cemetery is where the burial was taking place. We only have 1 picture of that the third building, and it was taken late 1880s or the early 1890s. It was used until 1892. And this is just a great picture. It's from Shiloh Museum. It has all the students and the teacher in there. And they're all dressed in their Sunday best and looks great. The boys love them, are like in overalls and barefoot. You see one little girl here, and she's got a little lunch pail. And a lot of them are holding books. And again, they don't have a date on the picture, but I do have some relatives that are in this photograph. We have a list of names. And one of them is a little boy, kind of in the middle here, and his name was John Buchanan. And John was a relative of mine, and he was born in 1882. So he looks to be around 8 or 9 in this picture. Looks to be in trouble also. Someone's holding his shoulders there. And also his sister, her name was Effie Buchanan, one of his sisters, and she died in 1892 from a snake bite. So we know the photograph was taken before she died because she's in the picture. So. And now I'm going to back up a little bit to go to the pre-Civil War years in Farmington. First of all, it was not an incorporated town, and it was not named yet. There was one main road, and it was called the Fayetteville-Cane Hill Road. And part of that road now is Highway 170. And it was there was several houses along the road, and also a mill. The first mill in Farmington was near that road. Its location was near our current city ballparks. And the mill was owned by Abram Allen, and it was powered by horses and mules. In 1861, Abram Allen sold the mill to his nephew, William Ingalls. So during the Civil War, William Ingalls owned the mill, and so people started referring to Farmington as Ingalls Mill. So the first name of Farmington it was called Ingalls Mill during those years. During the war, most families in the area, of course, they lost a lot of the young men during the war. They also lost their crops. They were destroyed, the horses were stolen, and the hogs were killed to feed the troops. So many of them just left the area. It was devastated. And some of those, they tried to get their money back. It took about 10 years to get reimbursed for the horses and the hogs at that time. After the war, Colonel Marcus LaRue Harrison, he formed military farm colonies. They were also called Union Farm colonies. And it was in several of the just devastated areas in Benton and Washington County. And one of those areas that he picked for the colonies was Ingalls Mill. And so it was to protect the people in the community who were starving and just devastated. And so they were to move into the colonies, and they were given food, supplies, shelter, seeds for the new crops, and most importantly, protection from the outlaws and the bushwhackers. After the war, between the years of 1868 and 1870, William Ingalls, who owned the mill, he moved the mill to a location in between his house, which was called the Ingalls House, and it's still standing today, and his wife, Isabel Kennebrew Ingalls, in her house. And I got a photograph of both houses. The Kennebrew house at that time was actually a 2-story log cabin. And it was built again on the same location by John Kennebrew and his wife, Virginia Shreve Kennebrew, in 1879. The mill was located between the two houses near the creek. It was a steam-powered mill at the time. William Ingalls also named the town, he renamed it Farmington by 1870, and he drew up a plat, and then he sold lots for $50 each in trying to get people to move to Farmington. By 1870, the town had a store, a mill, a doctor, a blacksmith shop, a wagon factory, a post office. William Ingalls sold his mill in the mid-1870s to John Cato, and he was the one he had a wagon factory also. John Cato built a distillery in the mid-1870s near the mill, and it consisted of 2 buildings, both of them made of rock. One of them was used for storage. And they were really known for the good sour mash whiskey. They ran the distillery for over 25 years. There were several store owners in the 1800s. I don't have a list of all the names, but I do know that late 1890s, there were owners by the name of Ed Smith and Pettigrew and Pickens, which have been Frank Pettigrew and William Pickens. And their stores were on the north side of Main Street, where the distillery and the mill were also. In 1888, a Christian church came to Farmington. It became very popular. It was in Farmington for many years. It sold the building in 1965, so it was there for many years. They sold it to the Nazarene Church in 1965 at that time, and then they ceased to exist in Farmington. In the 1880s, the Baptist Church, it shared a building with the Masonic Lodge. It was located on the corner of Bodark and Vine Street. But when the Christian church came to town in the 1880s, Farmington was too small to really maintain 3 churches. And so the Baptist church at that time merged with the Baptist church in Bethel Grove, and they called that the Little Elm Baptist Church, which still is here today. In the early 1890s, the first brick schoolhouse was added, and it had 2 rooms. And later on, like in 1902, they added a 3rd room. The same time period, the Methodist church built a new building on North Main Street. That street's now called White Street. And they were there for several years until they moved into their new location off of Highway 170. The Masonic Temple was located right next door to the Methodist church. And they were active in the same building until last year, around 2016. In the early 1900s, the railroad came to town in Farmington, and they had a depot. And that brought lots of new business, especially for the farming industry, for fruits. Several families grew strawberries and apples. And they put them on the railroad and the train, and they would ship them off to other companies. Welch grapes was also very popular at that time. And they would grow lots of grape vineyard. Farmington is also. Stark Brothers Nursery came to town in 1902, and they were here until 1970. And they grew fruit and shade trees and shrubs. And this brought a lot of extra jobs and income to Farmington. Before that, most were farmers, and they just lived off the land, but now they had opportunity to make an income as well. This also brought canning companies. There were 2 that I know of. They were called Appleby, and also one that was run by the Hamlin brothers. At this time, a lot of the downtown area, the stores moved to the south side of town. Al Bentley, he was the manager of the Farmington Stark Brothers Nursery, and Leslie Hobo Hickman was the foreman. And Al Bentley came in town, and his wife Dot, and they bought a big, beautiful house in the middle of town, and Dot loved to throw parties. So she would invite a lot of the younger adults into these big parties, and they would go all out, and they'd wear hats and big dresses, and the guys would wear suits and get all dressed up, and they'd also take pictures throughout the town before their parties. And I'm very fortunate to say in my family, we had relatives who were in that age group. They took lots of pictures, and so we have several of those photos that were made throughout the town. And one of them was taken in front of the rock wall of the distillery. The distillery was, again, made of rock, but they took the rocks down when it was closed to be used for other buildings, but they left one wall for some time. So we've got a picture of that one wall with these people in front of it. The next picture was taken from across the creek from the mill, which is at the hillside next to the Ingalls house. And the next picture is steps or part of the foundation of the first Ebenezer school in church. By the 19-teens, most of the stores, again, were on the south side of Main Street then. And from this picture, you can tell there's the first building on the left. That was first owned by Jesse Sidwell, and he had a small store and a post office. And later he sold that store to the McNeils, and that was open until the 1970s. Next to that were scales. People would drive their wagons up to the scales, and they would weigh how much it was before and after a trade. And the building beside that has been several things over the years. It was a McNeil store for a while. It was a bakery, a garage, donut shop, a t-shirt shop, and I knew it as the Coleman House. I think its first store, though, was actually from Frank Reef. And a little bit past that, there was a store. It was a smaller store. It was owned by Williams, and he also had a post office there at one time. Later, he sold the store to White's, and they ran White's Grocery. They added on to it, made it a lot bigger. And it was there for many years, and now it's still there. The building's still there, and it's called the Onion Creek Gifts, I think it is. Main Street was not paved until like the mid-1920s. And there were no bridges over the creeks for the horses or the wagons. So the road was often muddy, and there were bridges, though, for walking across on both sides of Main Street. And I do have a picture of one of those bridges. This is the one that's closer to the mill. And the little boy in the picture is my grandfather, Thornton Buchanan. In 1925, Farmington built the first high school. In 1928, they had the first graduates of the high school. At that time, they started a new tradition where they would engrave their graduates' names onto the sidewalk of the school. And that went on as a tradition until 2003, when they stopped doing that. In 1934, the old mill burned down. In 1937, the Church of Christ came to Farmington. They built the first building, though, was built in 1945. In the 1940s, several of the smaller communities in the area consolidated with the Farmington School. And those communities were the Savoy, the Highland, or Highland Church, White Rock, which was also called the Double Springs community, the Bethel Grove, and the Walnut Grove. Those who went to Walnut Grove, I think, had a choice to go between Prairie Grove or Farmington. In the 1950s, they added more school additions in buildings, including an indoor gym, and in 1959, a new high school. So in the early years of Farmington, church and school were the center of social events. The churches had meetings, fellowships, potlucks, and picnics. The schools had sporting events, carnivals, and plays. The town also had a baseball team with young adults or even older adults in some cases, and they would play small communities like Prairie Grove and Lincoln. And I do have 3 pictures from those baseball teams ranging from the years of 1905 to 1948. And they were big events in the town. Everybody would come out and watch these games. It was a big deal to go to the ball games at that time. Farmington is not a small town now. People have more activities in other towns as well. Most of them work in Fayetteville, in Springdale, in Bentonville. But it's still a good place to live and a great place to raise a family.
Let me do a quick follow-up question. One of
Sure.
the baseball players that's probably the most well-known is your grandfather.
Yes.
Thornton Buck Buchanan. Talk
Yes.
about him and tell me how you got his nickname, if you know, and kind of a little bit about his baseball skills.
Okay. My grandfather, who was born in 1909, his name was Thornton Buchanan, and he was a big baseball player. And he played until he was, I'm not sure how old, but probably up until he was in his 50s for these small town baseball teams. And he also was a boxer. And somewhere along the line, he got a nickname called Thornbuckle Buck. And they'd also just call him Buck most often. And he was known for going into town in the Fayetteville and playing baseball, walking home, eating dinner, and then going back at night and boxing. And he actually was on a minor league baseball team called the Fayetteville Angels in the 1930s. And they played on a league that was in Missouri and Arkansas. And that was during the Depression years. And after that, he mostly would just played on a lot of the Farmington teams. Again, he was still an older adult playing on these teams, and they would play, again, Prairie Grove, Lincoln, and a lot of the smaller communities, West Fork, Greenland. And so, yeah, he was really known for being a pitcher. He was a lefty. And
one other thing about him, now it's my understanding that he started the Cardinal.
yes,
Talk about that, and then because there's been a lot of people talk about that and the honey buns, and it was just kind of a local. It was basically the only place in town to eat. And so, talk about that. That's a little more current, but.
my grandfather, Thornton Buchanan, was also one of the earliest mayors of Farmington. And he was also involved in many of the school events. And he and his wife, who was Maureen Mays Buchanan. And in the late 1960s, they opened up a restaurant called the Cardinal Drive-In. And it was a very popular for many years, and they were known for their homemade pies. And they had foot-long corn dogs and chili dogs, and they had honey buns. It was just a very popular place to go eat. They would have picnic tables outside, and it was really common to order food from the outside window and go sit on a picnic table under the tree and eat, after school snack or for dinner. And they had a big garden in the back of the restaurant. And so they grew all their own vegetables out there and fresh tomatoes and lettuce. And so they had great burgers too, and French fries, the kind that are just really greasy French fries that were so good. And it was a very popular place to go for many years.
One other thing, and this is a little more current, but what do you remember about the old Griff Wilson farm? And then if you do remember about the Southwinds was kind of one of the really big developments. Do you know enough to talk about that?
Yes, I left off part of the Stark brothers, sorry.
No, that's all right, because
okay.
I know that we have that old picture of the Griff Wilson farm, and I don't remember the farm, but I do remember the field. So kind of talk about how that went from a house and a farm to a sprawling big development.
Okay. Al Bentley's house, which was on the center of town, and he was the one that was the manager of Stark's. And they were known for having this big packing shed where they did a lot of their business, so all the employees would check into work. And the first packing shed was destroyed by a tornado, and then they rebuilt another one. And its location was south of the current Southwind subdivision. They had this big packing shed. At that time, it was just in the middle of a big field. Later on, like around the 1940s, Al Bentley sold his house to Griff Wilson. And so he became the owner of the house, and most people today knew that house as the Griff Wilson house.
One other thing, you were in school at the time, probably pretty young, but do you remember the excitement of the state championship, the teams winning? I know you weren't in high school yet, but do you remember that do you remember anything from that?
When I was in school, like in the 1970s, again, at that time, everybody in town would come out for all the ball games. That was a big deal. And there was a time when we won state championship, I think 3 years in a row. And everybody in town would go to those games. I remember very well going to all those games. I was young, but I remember very well. And it was a big deal. We all went to Danville one year. I remember that. I was probably, I don't know, 8, 9 years old, maybe even younger. But the entire town showed up. And it was a big deal. It really was. It was good times.